Thank you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start now, Arnell. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jody Prescott, and I am absolutely delighted to be able to present to you this panel today to talk about gender in civil affairs operations with a slight detour through doctrine. Have a group of very distinguished panelists with me on this panel. Very much looking forward to being able to share their experiences and the incredible depth and breadth of the different work that they have done in different parts of the world with you today. The way we'll go ahead and start is I'll go ahead and give you a brief presentation on civil affairs doctrine and gender, tying it particularly to our allies doctrine, looking at the Aussies, looking at, for example, our allies in NATO. And the reason why I want to do that is because I was very fortunate to be part of a group of people who got to present some feedback in terms of how we might best incorporate gender into the new version of FM 3-57 that will be coming out. So with that, I'll go ahead and start. And of course, the views that I express in my part of the presentation, but actually I guess that's true for all of us, isn't it, ladies? These are our personal views, right? They're not necessarily those of any government agency. Now, before I give this presentation, one of the things that I want you to know that I understand right up front, I'm not civil affairs. I'm a retired JAG. And I recognize that in terms of talking about doctrine, I'm not talking to a community of theory. I'm talking to a community of practice. That being said, well-written doctrine has got its uses. Most importantly for our discussion today, I think it provides a crosswalk point for our allies in terms of being able to look at our doctrine and figure out how the changes that they're making in their doctrine, particularly in the NATO context and Australia, how that fits into what we're doing, where those places are that we could link up. Now, the other thing that I want to recognize right up front is that there is absolutely no question as to whether civil affairs recognizes the significance of gender in operations in the field. It clearly does, and it clearly has. But unless you begin incorporating some of this experience into publicly available doctrine, you run the risk of losing, unnecessarily so, very valuable lessons.
There you go. Yeah, hello, this is Bill Hestwood. I finally was able to join.
Hi, Bill. We had gone ahead and started.
Oh, that's
fine.
like to
proceed?
Yeah, just keep going. You already started, so keep going.
Okay, very good. I was an active duty JAG for 25 years. To be honest, I never thought about gender in military operations until I was in Afghanistan 2008, 2009. Towards the end of my tour there, I spent about 3 weeks down in Zabul province. Ordinarily, I was on a pretty tight leash up in Kabul. Went down there working on environmental damage claims and crop damage claims at FOB Wolverine. It opened my eyes a bit. When I got back, I started researching the connections between war, women, and worsening weather. Our government and our allies have recognized for some time now that war in general impacts women and girls differently and more severely than it does men and boys, particularly in those areas of the world where women are already marginalized politically, socially, economically. At least in the international development community, there is a growing recognition that climate change also has gender differentiated impacts, and that in general, and in particular where women are already marginalized in their societies, these effects are harsher on women and on girls. So, suppose you are working in a conflict country that has been experiencing climate change or at least environmental degradation. If you were working in a place where both of these are occurring together, it came to me that these could have a compounding negative effect on women and girls in those areas. And what was particularly troubling about that was that this meant that they would have different security needs than, say, the men and boys. But unfortunately, our systems were not set up to count this sort of thing. When you look at the way U.S. doctrine at the joint level has evolved since the time I got back from Afghanistan, there are very significant instances where the operational relevance of gender has been factored in. So, for example, in the area of foreign humanitarian assistance, the latest stability doctrine. These are two really good examples of the work that many have been doing, whether at Carlisle or down in Suffolk in the J7, to get gender incorporated into our doctrine in a way that makes sense, in a way that's operationally relevant. On the other hand, there is doctrine where gender is surprisingly absent. The two that stick out for me the most at this point are joint urban operations and civil military operations. Now, in terms of the joint urban operations, just by looking at the date on the doctrine, let's be frank, long. For all I know, it is perhaps undergoing revision as we speak. But the notion of not including gender at all, when the focus of your operations is specifically on populations in built-up areas where the population is probably at least half female, is just very, very surprising. But more surprising to me than that was the fact that it's absolutely absent at the joint level in terms of civil military operations. Now, a bit of shameless promotion before I go on. Next month in Parameters, there'll be an article that I wrote on including gender in joint level CA doctrine. And there will also be a companion piece coming out in the Royal United Services Institute Journal that ties together with that article, talking about how to move from gender analysis of an area of operations to an analysis of the risk from neglecting gender. Now that ties into thinking about below the joint level, right, in terms of how we deal with gender at the service level with the land force components. So if we were to look at what we have right now in terms of our service level CA doctrine, I say gender present, but it's just barely. So for example, in the existing version of FM 3-57, women are just lumped in as one of a vulnerable category of people. When you get down to the tactical level publications, which are supposed to be providing us kind of like the nuts and bolts of a part of how we do our work, in terms of the descriptions of helpful persons in an area of operations that you might want to include in your analysis, these bits of doctrine say include gender if applicable. Well, by and large, populations are going to be half men and half women. When is gender not going to be applicable? Instead, what this doctrine is suggesting is that gender is an anomaly, and that is that if you have the rare instances where females are helpful persons whose gender is worth noting in the analysis in an otherwise male-normed bit of doctrine, then that's what you should do. From my perspective, this is not gender neutrality, this is gender blindness. This carries forward further when we look at the other doctrine that we'd use at the service level, the land force component, in terms of thinking about conducting the actual civil affairs operations. And yet, at the same time, despite the fact that gender is just completely absent here, we know, I know from my experiences in Bosnia, Croatia, and from Afghanistan, where I've worked with civil affairs units, this is something that CA thinks about all the time. It is surprising that there is such a complete disconnect between the way things are done and the way that the doctrine, at least currently, is written in this regard. When we look at our allies in NATO, for example, we'll find that NATO has done a great deal of work to begin including the operational relevance of gender, where appropriate, into doctrine. We see it in terms of, for example, the more recent stability and reconstruction doctrine, and to a significant degree in the CIMIC doctrine that NATO has. NATO also has the advantage of having a gender center of excellence certified to it, the Nordic Center for Gender Military Operations in Kungsängen in Sweden. Importantly, NCGM provides much of the intellectual firepower for NATO in terms of curriculum development and suggestions for changes in doctrine. It's complemented to a significant degree by the work that's done by the CIMIC COE in the Netherlands, which, as you all know, is a largely Dutch-German, but also other nations involved, center of excellence focusing on civil military affairs. The CIMIC COE has done amazing work in terms of providing practical examples of how gender matters in operations, and then tying that together with civil affairs doctrine like publications in general, and also factoring in the environmental impact and to a degree, the role of climate change. When we look to the Australians, they have been undergoing a significant amount of revision in their doctrine as well. And so we find that doctrine is now being included in the revisions that the doctrine is, gender is being included in the revisions that doctrine is now going through. More significantly, in terms of the forward thinking shown by the Aussies in this regard, two recent documents within the last couple of years, and they're not necessarily doctrine, they're doctrinal notes, so I think they're probably more designed to get conversation going and get thinking going as to the best way to deal with these kind of cutting edge issues. At the very least, what the Australians have done here is specifically approach the operational relevance of gender in terms of even the kinetic parts of kinetic operations. And as an attorney, thinking about the law of armed conflict, that's particularly where I'm concerned in terms of making gender relevant as well. At the Australian land force component level, their CIMIC doctrine doesn't necessarily have as much about gender as you might expect looking at their other doctrine, but what it does have is a very significant treatment of how to be factoring in risk in terms of providing the civil affairs analysis to commanders and to planning staffs. And for me, that's very important because when I was writing my book, Armed Conflict, Women and Climate Change, I didn't end up where I thought I was going to. I ended up coming to the conclusion that gender is not always relevant in operations from a perspective of risk. So for example, in a force-on-force engagement, equipment heavy, outside of populated areas, I don't know that the gender of the participants necessarily creates much of a risk in terms of how that's going to play out. On the other hand, for civilian-centric operations, focusing on populations, even though I don't have a lot of data, and I will admit that straight up, I don't see how it can't be important from the perspective of risk. And this is not just risk to women in the operational area. This is risk to the mission and to its personnel by potential failure to consider the impact of gender on its operations. So, Bill, I'll go ahead and stop there, sir. That's just the introduction that I wanted to give. And I look forward to hearing the presentation and discussions of my fellow participants. and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jody. I'll go ahead and go through my short little presentation then. I guess I have to do my own share slides here, I guess. I'll already do that. So hopefully you can see my slides. I'm not sure if they're showing up over there or not.
Not
Yes,
yet.
sir.
Nope, you'll need to share your screen, Bill.
Well, I thought I did that. Apparently, I don't know how to do that, I guess. So, all right, I don't know. My entire screen, maybe. Okay. Share. All right, all right. All right, for some reason it's not letting me do it, so I'll just talk from my slides and hopefully that'll suffice. So, all right, so we're talking here about not only civil affairs doctrine and its update, but also Army doctrine and its update. So it's kind of interesting. The Army, as most of you know, is going through a pretty major doctrinal revision, getting away from the coin type environment and getting back into the large scale combat operations environment. So a lot of the manuals are being rewritten to reflect that, and also the multi-domain operations concept that the Army is looking at. So those are some of the big changes there in the Army doctrine. So one of the big changes that we're also looking at is adding women, peace, and security principles into the Army foundational doctrine manuals. To kind of carry on a little bit from the previous discussion, we want to add a gender perspective to a lot of the Army doctrinal manuals. So it is important to understand that gender in this case is more, and not necessarily just sex, but it's more than that. It's really the roles and responsibilities of men and women as viewed by a local society. And where are men and women engaged in the population, and what their roles are, what their responsibilities are, what they're allowed to do within a society. So those are some of the considerations when we're talking about gender perspective and gender analysis. So one of the other things is every theater, there's a gender advisor that advises the theater staff. And within the Army, they're looking at adding what they call a gender focal point to all battalions and above. And the roles, responsibilities of a gender focal point is it's an additional duty for somebody on the staff, but it's their responsibility to encourage the battalion and above staffs to look at things from a gender perspective. So we've submitted several recommended verbiage changes to FM 3-57, the Civil Affairs Operations Manual, and that is going to be briefed this Friday to the Special Operations Center of Excellence, CG. And then hopefully after that, it will go out for some staffing, and they're hoping to publish that probably April, May timeframe of next year. And then that will be followed by an ATP on each of the civil affairs competencies thereafter. One of the big changes in FM 357 will be to repurpose the CMOC from what it is now apparently a line item on a TOE for a civil affairs company, and take it back to what it used to be, which is a task organized, coordinating, synchronizing, and integrating element for the commander's civil military operations plan. So that's going to be kind of a big change. Now, with all doctrine, of course, there's always the hope for publication date, and then it usually gets delayed by several months. So don't be surprised if the new FM is not coming out in April or May of next year. So women, peace, and security, in spite of its name, is more than just women. It's really looking at things, again, from a gender perspective and understanding, as Jody was saying earlier, that the way armed conflict and humanitarian disasters affect men and women and boys and girls is different. And so we need to look at that and understand the differences so that we can appropriately respond to the situation. It's also a background. Go ahead. Somebody had a question or a comment?
Just want to let you know your slides are up. Well, just tell us when to hit slide and we'll go next.
Oh, great. Okay, I'm on slide 3. Okay. If you can go to slide 3, please. Thank you. So it's kind of important to understand that. And so as you're planning a military operation, especially in stability operations and humanitarian disaster responses, you take that gender perspective into consideration. And then that will better help the unit become effective in whatever that operation is. So if you go to the next slide. Slide 4, please. Okay. So you can see there on the right, the Women, Peace, Security principles, and a lot of those do overlap with protection of civilians. But the main focus is really the meaningful participation of women in whatever is going on with stability operations and conflict resolution and with the response to humanitarian disasters. It's been found that if women are participating in a productive longer than if the women are excluded. And there's several reasons for that, of course, depending on what society you're in, but the women bring a different perspective than an all-male organization would. And they do have access to different information and have different needs and things like that needs to be addressed. So next slide. Go to the next slide. There you go. So where did women, peace, security come from? It came from a UN resolution back in the year 2000. And since then, a lot of countries, 84 countries, as a matter of fact, have worked up a national action plan for women, peace, and security. The United States had one, and then in 2017, the Congress passed and the President signed a Women, Peace, Security Act, which tasked the Department of Defense, Department of State, USAID, and Department of Homeland Security to write an implementation plan and to do some certain training and other things to support the national action plan that the United States had at the time. So that national action plan was actually superseded in 2019 when a U.S. strategy on women, peace, security came out, and that was signed by the President. And then just earlier this year, all 4 of those agencies that I mentioned came out with their implementation plans. So next slide. So this is kind of a crosswalk between the national strategy, which has the 4 lines of effort that you see on the sides there, and the 3 defense objectives that are in the Department of Defense implementation plan. So we as a service, the Army as a service, the Navy as a service, etc., can really only influence defense objective number 1, which is including the gender analysis and the women, peace, security principles into doctrine and training, PME strategies, and then also kind of modeling some of those principles, which would include having more women in the Army, not only as military, but also more women civilians, but particularly in leadership positions and higher ranking positions. So next slide. That might be my last slide. I don't know.
That's your last slide, sir.
That's my last slide. Okay, you can turn them off then. Thank you. So I do apologize. I don't have a camera on my computer. So anyway, so that concludes my discussion. I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Gannon.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sue Gannon. I'm the current CENTCOM military advisor to USAID. And I'll keep my remarks pretty brief to follow into the both Jody and Bill's discussion on doctrine. I'm going to focus mine more on how we integrate gender into strategic level planning. I'm a latecomer to CA, so I have done most of my work at civil affairs up at the strategic and theater level, because I did not come in until I was a mid-level major. And one thing that I've noticed that we are challenged with as a community of practitioners is that the tactical level, we're very good at understanding the nuances of gender within smaller villages or regional areas. Where we struggle to get the considerations for gender to be brought in is up in that strategic planning level, and making sure that that strategic level commander can understand the implications to his operation on the ground. And so for me, it's something that I have learned much the hard way, but I think that it's important to remember that we serve as this connection point to the critical players across the interagency who are the experts and are really working these issues. And you're going to hear from a couple of those people later on in the panel here. And also understanding how we can help better train and inform our own forces so that we have a better understanding across the force. It's not just civil affairs' job to understand gender. It expands well beyond the civil affairs force. Civil affairs forces are one small part of a major operation. So we need to make sure that that is integrated into that higher level planning. So what I challenge everyone here as we listen to the group is hopefully a takeaway from this panel is when you return back to your formation or your organization is how do we get these very critical understanding of gender as we update our doctrine, and hopefully the update of the doctrine will lead to us being better at integrating it into that higher order planning, right? But at the same time, how can we better have a better understanding of what it means to integrate these considerations? How do we communicate to that battlefield commander on the ground, and how do we make sure that we integrate with our interagency and NGO partners as we work across the battlefield, because we don't work within a silo. So my comments are actually fairly short because you're going to be amazed by a couple of the follow-on panelists here who really have some depth in these considerations that we as planners, especially at the strategic level, need to understand so that we can better inform the commander and at the end of the day, achieve sustainable results. And that's all I have at this time.
Okay, great, Lieutenant Colonel Gannon, thank you very much. So we'll go over to Lieutenant Kennedy now. And go ahead, Lieutenant Kennedy.
Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Kennedy, and I'm currently serving as a TPU reservist in the 2 shop with the 450th Civil Affairs Battalion Airborne out of White Plains, Maryland. On the civilian side, I'm a contractor for the State Department, where I lead the Global Defense Reform Program, which is state's effort to embed and otherwise provide intermittent advisory services to foreign ministries of defense. So those of you who might be familiar with the MODA program implemented by DoD, it's a similar program over on the state side. I'm really honored to be on the panel today with 2 of my mentors, Colonel Caroline Pogge and Lieutenant Colonel Sue Gannon, who was actually the commander of the 450th during my first several years at the unit. I come to the Army by way of the Peace Corps. So there are not a ton of soldiers who are also returned Peace Corps volunteers, but there are a handful of us. So from 2006 to 2008, I served for 2 years as a health volunteer in a rural village in Zambia, not far from the border with the Democratic Republic of Congo. And one of the really beautiful things about coming to the Army after Peace Corps is that I'm usually pretty impressed with Army field conditions. So the first time that hot A's showed up while I was out at a training exercise and I didn't have to build a fire and cook my own food over it, I was pretty blown away. Truly, even in an austere environment, I think we've got such excellent logistics and other support for our soldiers. And I think it's something that really distinguishes the U.S. military from some of our partners. Unlike some of my co-panelists, I don't have experience deploying with a CA unit. If Colonel Gannon is a latecomer to CA, then I'm really a latecomer. I joined the Army 5 days before I would need an age waiver as kind of a mid-career change, and it was a door to service that I didn't want to close. So I came in as an MI officer and will reclass to 38 here in the next year or two. But I do have a decade and a half of experience working in more than 50 countries, and I hope that I can offer a couple of observations on gender and maybe some practical advice that we can start implementing today to mainstream gender, not just in our doctrine, but also how we operate day to day in civil affairs units. So the first part of what I want to touch on is around recruiting. I know this isn't a recruiting panel, but if there is one in the future, I'd be happy to weigh in on that one too. But I do think it's important because when we want to address gender, I think it starts with who's in the formation. The soldiers that we have today are the ones who are going to be following the doctrine for sure, but whoever is in the formation now, those are going to be our leaders and our doctrine writers 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now. So who we have in the community is, in my mind, really important. And if we focus just on bringing in folks from other MOSs who really grew up steeped in the Army way of doing things, are we really getting that diversity of perspectives that we're looking for, or are we closing ourselves off to other perspectives that could be really important to integrate? And I would argue even that a man who spent the formative years of his career supporting the interagency or doing humanitarian assistance, he might have a better perspective on gender and a fresher look than to the CA community than, you know, maybe a female former MP who happens to be a woman, but who really grew up having a lot of the same experiences as those serving next to her. So I just really want to encourage us to think about gender, not just as, you know, who happens to be a woman and can speak to this, but who has a variety of experiences in some of the places that we're operating, who can contribute their view into the CA community. And the first step in my mind is bringing them into the community and bringing them into the formation. So as Lieutenant Colonel Gannon pointed out today, and also in a panelist session that we had before the talk today, it's not just women who can think about or talk about gender or engage with the female local population. So I think it's always a good first step to look around and say, you know, hey, there are no women at this table. And I hope we never stop saying that when we notice it. But I think that the change that needs to happen is really more broad than having, you know, one or two females around the table. And in civil affairs, we talk a lot about bringing in civilian experts and mid-career professionals to contribute. And I would consider myself proof that there are people who are willing to come into the Army and into civil affairs, you know, mid-career and beyond. But it was pretty difficult to find my way into the community. I actually found a 38 golf concept paper that then I think Colonel Goddard, who's now, I believe, a 2-star, wrote, and I cold emailed him and said, 38 golf, you know, this is what I want to do. And it took a lot more networking and a lot more pushing to sign a contract with the Army than I would have expected. So it was pretty difficult for me to find my way into the formation. And I think that, you know, if we can figure out how to draw in folks from other areas across the interagency, from some of our NGO partners, from the nonprofit world, you know, we're only going to add to the perspectives that we're later drawing on when we do doctrine revisions and things like that. So while a longer term goal might be a shift in the CA recruiting pipeline, I think that there are things we can do now to capitalize on people that are already in our formation. So I really think that we should all challenge ourselves to understand who is in the formation, who are even the junior officers or junior enlisted personnel, what experience do they have on the civilian side in their personal life that might be totally divergent from what they're working on at the unit, but could be relevant to gendered perspectives. It could be somebody who is volunteering their time at a transitional shelter for homeless women and children. It could be someone with community organizing experience, someone with a social work background, people with experience at their church or faith community, or even who grew up overseas for a part of their life, may really have a lot to contribute to how we think about gender. And then as far as kind of honing our gender lens, from my experience, I think I've learned that, you know, you can have the best cultural briefs in the world, but when it comes right down to it, you need to ask questions once you get there to really figure out the gender piece. And if there's something I'd like to offer in terms of practical advice, it might be that we can learn to ask better questions and learn to really listen for the response. It's what people say, and it's also what they don't say. So to get really good at asking questions and start by assuming you don't know, not by assuming that you do know. There's a common example in the international development community about, you know, trying to solve the problem of women walking really long distances to get water. And so instead of them having to walk 10 miles out to the closest well, to put the well in the middle of the village, and then, you know, the women aren't using it. Why? Because that, you know, that walk away from the village, away from their responsibilities, is the only time they have to talk, to be away from their husbands, to have a minute to socialize. And so had they been consulted, you know, maybe the well would have been placed closer to the village, but not right in the middle. And so that's an example I'm sure that a lot of you have heard before, but I think it's relevant because it's this constant practice of asking the question, and making sure that we don't assume we know what the solution is for a population, or even that an American woman in uniform can know what the solution is for another woman in a totally different context. And something that I like about the doctrine, I'm not an expert in the doctrine, but I have reviewed it. I like that some of the recommended changes include gender throughout. It's not a standalone section that can kind of be peeled off, but you're seeing references to gender, hopefully across all of the functional specialty areas. I do worry a little bit about it not being its own area of focus. It can get lost if it's not showing up in the same overarching charts and different things. But I think the answer where possible is it's both. It's a standalone consideration, and it's integrated across other areas as well. And I completely agree with Jody's points about women being 50% of the population. So in the active duty Army force, it's probably about 14%, and across the reserves, it's higher. Women represent probably 20 to 25% of the force, but in the population, it's 50% of the population are females. And if we ignore that, or if we allow our kind of default to the male that can sometimes get us by in a military environment to influence how we think about a civilian environment, we are going to miss out. And, we always say, train like we fight. And if you think you can ignore gender in garrison and just focus on it in training exercises a couple of times a year, and magically when you're downrange or in the doctrine writing room, you're going to start thinking about and planning for the impacts of gender, I think it's not going to happen. And so I challenge us all to think about ways that we can mainstream gender analysis right now in our meetings, our conference calls, the redesign of our own buildings. When I was at the 450th, we had our building in Riverdale, and there was no room for, there was no mother's room, there was no lactation room. People bounced around. I bounced around from Colonel Gannon's office to other people's office. There were male staff members who said, I'm not comfortable with that in my office. And when we built a new building in White Plains, Maryland, we have a dedicated room for our female soldiers to go. And so you don't need to wait until you're building a building in Afghanistan or Iraq. We can do it today in the buildings that we're designing for our own soldiers. So I'm going to leave you with 3 questions that I think we can integrate into our daily life. And the first one is, who might this action impact in a different way? Is anyone going to be left behind? Or who might this thing that we think is a good thing, who might this harm? So that's the first question, is who might this action impact in a different way? The second one is the most on the nose. Have we accounted for the presence of women? And we can do that, when we're planning our field exercises. You don't want to be in a situation where you're getting to the field and you haven't considered how lodging, latrines, showers are all going to be handled. I've been in training environments with breastfeeding moms who we are required by federal law, Army regulation, and I would argue basic human decency to accommodate them. And the training cadre were still forgetting about that soldier's needs on day 120 of training, even though they were the same needs as on day 1 of the training. I had the pleasure of spending a little bit of time with General Ferris over the weekend, and he noted how few female jump masters there are, and that some female soldiers would prefer for a female jump master to be checking their equipment, and that makes sense. And it's one of his personal passions to get more women through the jump master training pipeline. And I think asking that question at every stage of everything we do, from conference calls to trainings, have we accounted for the presence of women? And then the last question that I'll leave you with is a very general one that I think works for gender and works for other things as well. But what perspectives are we missing? And if in your meeting you said, does anyone, regardless of rank or position, see something we might be missing? Just imagine the transformative impact that would have if you heard your company commander or your battalion commander say that. Does anyone, regardless of rank or position, see something we might have missed? And very often, women are not going to be the loudest voice at the table, if they're at the table at all. But if we can build our own muscle in training and planning environments now, where we're asking, what are we missing? we're going to have a whole formation, in fact, a whole service of soldiers who from the highest to the lowest rank are really used to thinking about other perspectives. And I think that's going to pay dividends for when we think about gender. And I think it's going to pay dividends in a lot of other ways too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lieutenant Kennedy. Those were some great comments. So we'll turn it over now to Caitlin. Hopefully she's on.
I am. Hi, thanks.
Hey.
All right. Well, thank you, Bill, for inviting me, and thanks to the Civil Affairs Association for inviting me to join this panel today. My co-panelists have already hit on a number of the points that I wanted to stress, so I will trim my, my comments and just try and fill in some of the gaps. So thank you all to those who've already spoken. I'll be talking today a little bit about DoD's approach to implementing the WPS Act and how civil affairs plays a crucial role in that. So as Bill mentioned, obviously the strategic framework and implementation plan was released this summer in June, along with 3 of our interagency partners, so USAID, State Department, and Department of Homeland Security. And there's an inherent relationship between the department's ability to implement the intent of WPS, of the WPS mandate abroad, and how we organize, train, and equip our own forces. And this is reflected in the 3 overarching defense objectives that Bill had up on his slide here that are worth, or earlier, that are worth reiterating here. So the first overarching defense objective is that the DoD exemplifies a diverse organization that allows for women's meaningful participation across the development, management, and employment of the joint force. So that's the more inward-facing objective. Secondly, women in partner nations meaningfully participate and serve at all ranks and in all occupations in the defense and security sectors. And third, partner nation defense and security sectors ensure women and girls are safe and secure and that their human rights are protected, especially during conflict and crisis. You can see those second 2 defense objectives are more outward-facing. So in recognition of this, the SFIP is the first department-wide implementation plan that outlines how we will support the intent of the U.S. strategy and WPS through attention to the composition of our personnel and the development of our policies, plans, doctrine, training, education, operations, exercises, and engagements with partner nations. It's worth noting too that this approach supports the national defense strategy and increases our operational effectiveness by helping the department to 1, strengthen alliances and attract new partners by demonstrating U.S. commitment to human rights and women's empowerment, making the U.S. The partner of choice, and 2, to reform the department for greater performance and affordability by developing more effective strategies to mitigate risks and optimize mission success. So where does CA come into this conversation? Civil affairs actually plays a very vital role in implementing WPS. As the DoD's primary force, specifically trained and educated to understand, engage, and influence the civil component of the operating environment and provide civil considerations expertise, it's crucial that CA personnel include gender considerations in their work. And there are 2 primary beneficial outcomes to incorporating gender perspectives in military operations. One is that operations have a greater information about the human factors in the operational environment due to a more comprehensive assessment of friendly and adversarial actors. This is exactly what Kristen was just talking about. And 2, operations can better identify and mitigate unintended consequences of military action that inflict harm on host nation civilians. So it's not enough to say that because you interact with women in communities or because you have women on your teams, you have checked the box on WPS. Effective implementation entails including gender considerations in all phases of planning and operations. And I would just add to this, so you all have seen my bio. I'm actually very recently joined the Department of Defense after over a decade at the State Department, working in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. And as part of my job there, I conducted many assessments and analyses. That was a significant part of my work. But gender was not. And so without that very specific intentional approach to considering gender perspectives, there are things that we may have missed in our analysis, and the same can be said within civil affairs. Civil affairs core competencies, whether in the current FM 3-57 or those under consideration in the new draft doctrine, provide ample opportunity to incorporate WPS principles and thereby increase operational effectiveness. So one way to look at this is to consider what you risk by not incorporating gender perspectives in military operations. Kristen gave the great example of the PRT in Afghanistan, which interestingly enough formed the basis for a scene in the Whiskey Tango Foxtrot movie that was based on a true story. But there are plenty of other examples, including in DDR, where in Colombia, women who were in the FARC actively participated in the FARC were relegated to more traditional women's roles within society as they were being reintegrated. And understandably, we're unhappy with that. Similarly happened in Sri Lanka with the LTTE, and those women, a few of them ended up rejoining the LTTE. So I will just conclude by saying that I'm actually a big fan of civil affairs. I'm a believer in what you all do. And I'm pleased to be able to join you all today to share some additional considerations to help you carry out your missions more effectively. For anyone that would like additional information about WPS itself, either the act, the strategy, or the strategic framework and implementation plan, they can all be found online. As Bill said, he's the lead for the Army. And then my office within DoD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, is the lead for DoD. So please feel free to reach out. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. That was great. So we'll turn it over now to Colonel Pogge she's the last member of our panel, and then we can open it up for some discussion and questions to the rest of the group. Go ahead, Colonel Pogge.
Great, thanks. So Colonel Caroline Pogge, currently I'm on the dark side. I'm in the training world right now. So I'm the commander of the 1st Brigade Atlantic or 78th Training Division, depending on which format you look at. And so I was asked to talk a little bit more about my experiences. I've actually been in the CA community. I guess I'm the opposite of Sue. I started as a lieutenant. I came across when I was an AG officer back in 1999, joined the 411th Civil Affairs Battalion, and went to CAQC in October 2001. So I've been a CA officer. I'm coming up close on 20 years now, to include 3 deployments: OIF 1, OIF 8, and HOA in 13. And so I was asked a little bit to talk on the tactical perspective as a female civil affairs operator in those different places. And I will say, over those 20 years of deployments, or really 15 years of deployments, quite different experiences across both locations as well as the format of our teams. And so in OIF 1, obviously lots of different experience just from being part of the invasion of Iraq and just the chaos of that. But thankfully, our commander actually had the foresight of understanding some of the dynamics that the females would bring to the table. So as we set an ADVON party together to go link up with 2nd ACR, while ironically our trucks were still on a boat coming across the pond, he made sure that there's 2 of us going across that were female. So of the 8 folks that went north, you had Sergeant Navarro and myself trying to make sure that we had some impacts on the female perspective, as well as whatever engagement they might need with the 2nd ACR for that, until our team linked up with us and we had our other 3 females with us. And so I think that was really helpful for some of that initial confusion, trying to understand exactly what the female element would look like in Iraq and how we could engage them differently. Fast forward into 2008, and we had a really interesting opportunity where there was a SOF element right on the base with us in FOB Delta out in Wasat province. And the initial CA team leader didn't want anything to do with the RC side of it, but thankfully he was replaced fairly quickly with a new team who actually engaged us quite readily. They had no females in the SOF group, both on the CA side as well as the SF side. And so we were able to collaborate on quite a few opportunities both to draw on our gender capability as well as some of our backgrounds. And so we were doing quite a bit of business development and some other areas that they just didn't have the expertise on, but we happened to have from our civilian sector side a few folks that fit the bill for what they were looking for. And so I think that also brings up a piece, as Kristen said, it's not a recruiting forum, but it's also not an ACRC forum, but I'm going to take my 5 minutes of spotlight here to say, we do it really well when we do it really well, and we do it really poorly when we do it really poorly with the ACRC divide in CA. And I will say, and I was actually talking to now retired Lieutenant Colonel Dave Foster earlier today to confirm a few pieces in that piece in 2008. And it really comes down to who's there on the ground. And Dave and I had a great relationship, and we were able to really capitalize on both of our team's capabilities and where were able to fill each other's gaps. And I would say when I was in HOA in 2013, there was a Captain Jake Huber there with us who also did the same thing. And we had a great relationship between our CA, RC assets and his assets that he had across the fence, so to speak. And I think that's one thing that we also need to look at is not only where we can capitalize on our gender capability, but where we can also capitalize on some of our backgrounds and our overlaps and gaps and really filling in those pieces. And so that's another area that I think we need to do better on. And so again, working with Dave Foster in 2008 on the Iranian border was just a great opportunity to really tap into those areas where his team did not have any females on it, and he was able to call over and say, hey, Carol, I need help. Can you help me out with this mission that we're working on? And so Sergeant Carroll and I were able to be utilized in a different way. And also recognizing there's times where my face was not the face that needed to be in on the meeting, and also recognizing that you can't always be the, hey, just because I'm the team leader, I got to be there, and to be able to step back and thankfully had a great relationship with my team sergeant, who there'd be times where it's like, hey, this one's yours because we're not going to get anywhere if I'm the one talking. And so understanding some of the culture dynamics that we can't force on other folks as well. And I think that's another piece that we really need to continue to understand, that our perspective is not the only perspective, regardless of who we are in that conversation as Americans, as females, or as whatever. The other piece I want to talk about a little bit was in Horn of Africa in 2013. I was actually the battalion executive officer during that deployment. So a different perspective than being a team member, which I will definitely say is the best job in the Army. But unfortunately, with rank comes the inability to do that job at some point. The interesting thing with that opportunity is we ended up doing some training with the Ugandans and the Tanzanians as they were getting ready to work in the Congo and in Somalia, respectively. And it was shortly after there was the 2000 UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security that was being reviewed in 2010. And during that time period, they were recognizing that female peacekeepers did have a positive impact on operations, but there was often little training done prior to their mobilization into their respective locations. And so one of the things that we were tasked with was coming up with gender training for both the Ugandans and the Tanzanians. And the first thing they said is, hey, Pogi, can you do it? You're a woman. And I quickly said, yes, I'll do it, because it was a great opportunity. But at the same time, we needed to step away from, hey, we need a female to lead this training. And we really need to get, as many of my panelists have already said, understanding what the task is and understanding how to describe that and train for that, and be less worried about who the gender of the person is in front of the room. And in many times, I think there's a lot of power in males leading that conversation, especially in some of these countries that we're operating in. And so understanding what that required training is going to look like, but also understanding how we can best translate that into operational capacity for our partner nations. And so with that, I'm actually going to hand it back over to Bill, because I think the Q&A is probably where most of you want it to be anyway. So that's a little bit of the background to where we're coming from, and hopefully we can fill in some more during the Q&A. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Colonel Pogi. So we have a great panel here with a very diverse background, as you can see, and I'm sure they're going to offer up some great answers to your questions. So let's go ahead and get started. If anybody out there has a question or a comment or want to get a discussion going, please go ahead and get started. Yeah, I saw several things in the chat box from different people. So if somebody wrote something in the chat box, might want to follow up on what they wrote there.
Hey, Bill, we have to give them permission to talk on the side. They can't unmute themselves.
Oh,
So
we
I
do?
can
Okay.
go, yeah, we could go over to Emma Moore at the Center for New American Security.
Okay, I guess I can't do that because I'm, I guess, signed in as a guest or something here. So I have limited.
I believe if I hit answer live, she'll be able to speak.
Okay.
Hi, all. Can you hear me?
Yes, Emma, we can.
Thanks so much for your time and your great insights. I thought what Kristen said was particularly interesting, this idea of wanting people with relevant civilian expertise, but the pipeline to entry is actually fairly complex if the enlisted ranks are not always attractive to those individuals who might have even a master's degree. And then nested within that would be a question about how does civil affairs and psychological operations actually stand within, USASOC and have their piece heard and their goals addressed when I think a lot of SOF sees it as tangential, but it will play a significant role in great power competition and forthcoming roles and missions. Over.
Thanks, Emma. I can take the first piece of that, which is about, how we can get people into the civil affairs community who have that experience on the civilian side. And I went through this process kind of recently. I enlisted in 2016. And there are a couple of things that I'll point out as potential barriers to entry for people. First of all, do they know about Army civil affairs? I come from both of my parents were enlisted in the Navy. I actually considered going to the Naval Academy and made it all the way through the application process. And then when I looked at the roles that the Navy had, I didn't see anything that reflected something I thought I would be good at, where I could really contribute cross-cultural expertise. I loved learning languages, and I didn't even think about, the Army's the ground force. That's where I should be looking. So how much are we talking about our work and influencing the discussion around all of the opportunities that Americans would have to serve, whether it's in uniform or in other examples of national service. So number one, do people know about civil affairs? CA is not a direct accessions branch, so you have to do something else. I personally wasn't willing to join on the active duty side and potentially spend my entire first service commitment doing something else, who knows where, and give up my civilian career to start at the lowest ranks. And I actually considered joining as an enlisted soldier, despite having, a master's degree and by that point, 13 or 14 years of work experience. And someone said, no one's going to listen to you as a specialist, so you might as well have nobody listen to you as a lieutenant, and then at least be in the officer ranks. And it's really difficult. I mean, I don't think that I know enough about how the Army works a lot of times to really, be able to influence things at the highest level. I'm trying to learn, and I think by learning, I will be more credible later. But it's difficult if you're looking at someone who's even more experienced than I am, and asking that person to go to basic training and then to OCS, which is already a huge time commitment. It's almost a year of your life in a training pipeline. And the Army is sort of unique in that training requirement. So, I think as we reconsider recruiting and training in other critical areas like cyber, where we might have to think about how we bring people into the force who have those skill sets and let them have their civilian careers too. It's a conversation that's been had many times before on the civil affairs side, but I think that is a big piece. So, figuring out how we can bring people in, and I think 38 Golf is certainly one way to do that. And when I've considered 38 Golf for myself, some of the feedback that I get is like, people don't always know. People know what to do with the 38 Alphas, but the 38 Golf, like, not as much. So, I don't have the answers, but having recently gone through that decision process myself, I think that is still a challenge to bring in people with these really diverse civilian experiences. And I think that Caitlin or others might have something to add on the great power competition piece. So I will turn the floor over there.
I'll take a little bit of a stab on the power competition, because that's definitely not a simple solution, which is probably why we're all going, oh, I don't want to touch the unmute button. I think part of the issue you're going to have is twofold. Emma, you spoke specifically, I'm looking on the use of SOC side of it, and I can say I've never operated on that side. I was part of use of KPOC before the We Shall Not Speak of It divorce. And so it's one of those areas that is a lot of confusion, but not a lot of confusion depending on who you speak to. And I think part of it is we have distinct roles, we have distinct chains of command, and we have varying levels of engagement. I think one of the great things we have the opportunity is both the last CAR and the current Chief of the Army Reserve are both CA operators at one point in their life. And so I think we have folks at the highest level, at least on the RC side, that do have worked in CA, even if it was for a hot minute, and have that experience to be able to bring that perspective in. And I think it just becomes one of those value adds, the business proposition kind of concept of how do we prove our value. And I think one of the reasons why we should not speak of it is because we continue to harp on the divide. It continues to break down our ability to have a coherent conversation with the powers that be at both at any level. And so I think one of the things that we need to continue to do is show where the value is for across the board, not just the officer ranks, not just the RC or the AC ranks, whatever the case may be. We need to show that we have extremely talented soldiers at all ranks in all compos, and we need to continue to show that we bring value that could not come from anywhere else. And until we have that coherent and collective voice, I think we're going to continue to actually stop ourselves. So I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts there.
Hey, this is Sue. So I'd just like to add one more comment in terms of, and I do agree with Colonel Pogge. So one comment on the 38 Gulf program is that in the last year, all branches of the Army can now do direct appointments up to the rank of colonel based on civilian experience, right? So the Army abroad, the 38 Gulf program has a renewed push in that direction. And has actually boarded, I can't remember the exact number, I just saw it not too recently, but they've boarded quite a few in order for us to leverage, as several of the panel members have talked on, personnel that have very unique perspectives and backgrounds. Because I came to civil affairs as an active duty officer and was very much an output of the active duty Army institution, right? So I had to learn a lot as I came into CA because I had that very sort of formulated background. So the new 38 Gulf program is definitely gained some momentum in that direction and is seeking for this exact purpose, which is to gather in personnel who have this diversified experience to further enrich the force. Over.
And I would just add, I mean, I can't speak too specifically to GPC, but just recognizing that, you know, as global conflict evolves, the need to identify more sustainable security solutions that meet the needs of an entire population is, you know, grow, right? So as, you know, adversaries and competitors, you know, try to seek a strategic advantage, we've got to be better prepared. We and our partners need to be better prepared to meet those challenges. And I think a big part of doing that is recognizing the diverse roles that women play in conflict, and by incorporating their perspectives throughout our plans and operations.
And then before we close on the GPC side, speaking, you know, in my capacity, I'm a contractor for the State Department, so I can't speak on behalf of the department, but Caitlin, I heard a little bit of your comments on the last panel. And so you know, in our interagency coordination on the Global Defense Reform Program, we are working largely through the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, and really only this year started consulting with the Global Combatant Commands to kind of help us review the proposals that come in. And these proposals are requests for advisory services. And the way that State Department is trying to come after their advisory services to foreign ministries of defense is really from broad policy perspectives, a lot of global power competition focus, and then where DoD is often focusing their advisors in order to maximize some of the train and equip. So if we're selling F-16s to, Romania, that we need to make sure that the acquisitions processes and are there to support that equipment, and the recruiting is there so that people can fly these planes. I think on the State Department side, we're really looking at how can we improve governance, how can we focus on women, peace, and security, how can we improve civil military relations, and sometimes that's improving relationships between the ministries and the legislature to ensure that the legal frameworks are there. So, I haven't really heard mention at all of civil affairs. We're partnering a bit with SOCPAC out, doing a project in Mongolia that was really an idea that came up from something that one of their teams was working on. So I don't know how well the civil affairs community is plugged into working with the SCOs and the DATs at the embassy level, but, feeding those requirements up, then the SCOs can funnel them to different places for funding and to try to pull down on some of the civ-mil relations pieces. And I think if we can work with our partners in improving civil military relations, it achieves several foreign policy objectives around good governance, but also it's a place for us to play where some of our competitors might be focusing on other things like infrastructure projects, which hasn't been, a big thrust of our foreign policy. So I think that there are some tools there, and, finding the right way for the civil affairs community to plug into the existing lines where requirements are getting passed up and then being resourced down is probably one way that we can start to lend our expertise on the interagency side. Over.
Hey, Bill, since I don't think you can see the Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and make another one live if that works. For the panel, it's Dennis Cahill's question regarding current demographics within the total CA force with respect to breakout of males and females. There's been suggestion we should consider increasing the number of females in our force and perhaps task organizing female teams for WPS and gender engagements. So Dennis, unless there's anything additional to add, I'm gonna open that up to the group. So I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at that one.
Hey, good afternoon. This is Sue. So I'm going to take a stab at the first part when we talk about the breakout of male and female soldiers and rank structure. I think someone touched on it earlier, the percentage, the commonly known percentages of 15% in the active force, and I think 20 or 23% reserve force. Having recently come out of battalion command, my personal observation, especially in the operational reserve forces, even in the reserves where we have a higher percentage of women, is that I do not retain enough female leaders. And I would be open to any suggestions on how to keep more female leaders past the rank of E6, past the rank of captain, where they seem to drift a trit out. And it is really, we really need to, that is where I see the challenge in the breakout. I don't necessarily see it in terms of it becomes a male-centric organization. It's just keeping that diversity within the ranks and definitely keeping the leaders within it. And that's my comment there. Over.
Yeah, that's actually a good point about retaining more women so that they can have more women as senior leaders in the Army. And that's one of the things that we're looking at. So I'm a member of the Gender Equality Working Group that's run by the ASA MNRA's office. And that's been part of our discussion is how do we retain more women? So there's probably going to need to be some policy changes that would make it easier for women to be retained, or maybe to encourage women to be retained. So there's some perceptions, I think, that, if you're a female soldier and you want to start a family, having a baby kind of takes you out of the network for about a year or so, and that potentially could have detrimental effects on a female soldier's career. So we probably need to look at some different policy changes to kind of reduce the impact of some of that, and maybe then encourage more women to stay in. So that is something that we do need to look at. It's going to take a while to change. So hopefully panels like this can have a positive influence and make some recommended changes to policies. Over.
And to also, Dennis, to your comment on task orging for female teams, I'm actually not a FET fan, the female engagement teams. I'm not sure how others feel about it, but I was not a huge fan of that concept. And I think there is significant detriment to an all single gendered team, regardless of the gender. And as I said before, there were many times that I walked into an engagement and there would be times that I managed the engagement just fine and it would go smoothly and they recognized me for the role that I sat in as opposed to the gender that I held. And there's other times where I recognize within 3 or 4 minutes of talking to this person that I'd look at my team sergeant and go, this one's yours because I'm not going to get anywhere. And so I think there's a greater benefit for a mixed gender team, specifically in those regions of the world that may have gender biases to a point that could defeat any team's ability to operate should they be single gendered either way. Over.
So there's a couple of other questions here I see in the chat room that I'd take a stab at answering. So the gender perspective is a great start, and when do you see it kind of getting traction? Well, that's a great question, and I kind of see that getting some traction once we start to educate the rest of the Army about gender analysis and gender perspective and why it's important and how it can impact the overall mission. So it's going to take a while to educate people, and it's really more than just a civil affairs answer, because a lot of the other military folks, regardless of branch, are going to find themselves engaging a civilian population at some point, and they're going to need to understand the gender perspective and the gender analysis so that they can make the appropriate interaction with the population and have a positive engagement with the population. So one example of that, I think, is this was when I was deployed in 2005 to Iraq. Even though I'm retired Army, I was out in Fallujah with the Marines, and the Marine Civil Affairs unit out there, they had a young Iraqi woman come up to one of their civil affairs outposts and was seeking asylum, and they made the mistake of allowing her to come into the building and spend the night. And that actually created a massive international incident. And we literally had people from the State Department calling the MEF commander, who's Lieutenant General, like 2 or 3 times a day. And this took over a week to resolve. And it was all, just because of lack of understanding of the local culture and lack of understanding of taking things as a gender perspective. So I'll close there, or I'll stop there and allow any other discussion on that.
Sure, I'll jump in on that. And thank you very much for the question. I appreciate too that you raised the issue of intersectionality, because that is certainly a big aspect of this as well. And should be a part of any sociocultural analysis, frankly, as you're looking at race, gender, socioeconomic status. All of that should factor into your analysis of the environment that you're walking into. And also speaking to a question that John raised, and I'm not sure you all can see, so he asked how do you think CA could be better equipped to do gender analysis in conflict? This is from John Phillips. And so I think part of that, the answer on both of those is training, obviously. And I'll note that, as Bill said, there are gender advisors or WPS advisors at each of the combatant commands. And then there are also WPS focal points scattered throughout the department. There is training that's been developed for both WPS advisors as well as WPS focal points. And many of these individuals are also now equipped to kind of train others as well. So kind of train the trainers type of an approach. But frankly, that is going to take some time to get everybody trained up on these issues. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind some of the questions that Kristen raised, just in terms of questions that you ask yourself individually as you approach a plan or an operation, an engagement, anything, those questions of, have we considered how this will impact, the various groups, the various individuals in this community that we're walking into, whose perspectives have we not considered here? Who should have a voice in this? Over.
I can touch a little bit on the intersectionality piece too. I think that's a really great question. And just, it was only chatted to, I think, the panelists, but this recognition that, you know, looking at the police force, that minority, you know, police officers who are male have an affinity with the dominant group in terms of their maleness, but not necessarily in terms of their race. And certainly in the work that I've done internationally, I think in many cases, my whiteness and my Americanness overrode my femaleness. And I was allowed to do things that, you know, I think certainly women in that culture were not allowed to do, or was granted, sat at the table with the men while eating, while all of the other women were eating in another room. And there were other cases where it didn't matter that I was white and American. It wasn't going to change the fact that I was still a woman. And I think that the place to do the training around that might be at the individual operator level, because, you know, I went into the Peace Corps as an idealist and I came out as a pragmatist. And I think there are just some things about the local culture that you're operating in that you're not going to change, and you have to understand them and understand how you can and can't move. And to Colonel Pogge's point, you may be the right person to go into that conversation and you may not. And, you know, maybe in some long term, your presence might change how people think about what women can and can't do, or think about Americans as not just being white people. And you know, I can't tell you how many times people were disappointed when a minority American showed up at an event because they were expecting something else. And that's something I think we need to prepare our civil affairs community for experiencing when they're operating in the field, and a reality that, you know, you need to kind of seek the path of least resistance sometimes, and that when you're trying to achieve a mission, that's not always the time that you can focus on trying to change some of these deep ingrained beliefs. But I absolutely think that intersectionality is important. It's important in our analysis of our impacts, and it's also important in our training of our own force. Over.
I'd like to revisit John Phillips' question for a moment, if I could. And I'd like to tie it with the point that I see in the chat from the participant named Sexton. You say, our adversaries will target both male and female to sway public opinion against us. We must consider how gender may impact friendly operations in different regions when analyzing the AO. And John, you say, you know, how do you see CA's role in terms of injecting considerations of gender into decision making? And then how could CA be better equipped? I'd like to tie those all together by thinking about risk. It is great to see that we have begun moving past mere gender assessment of an area of operations and have been moving to gender analysis. We need to push that evolution further. To mainstream gender in military decision making, we need to make it convertible into currencies of risk. We need to start thinking about how does gender impact our operations in the area that we find ourselves working in. And to do that, that means, and I know this is going to sound a little weird, we need to also be flexible enough intellectually to view gender as a threat to the mission and to the personnel if it is not taken into account. And so from that perspective, I see three things, John, as being necessary. The first is, I just mentioned, we need to evolve our gender analysis into risk analysis of failing to consider gender, to be able to go to other staff planners and commanders and to set out things as risks and to give some probabilities of the bad things that could happen. And then even more importantly, no special advisor or staff officer wants to be the one to bring problems to the table without a solution. And so that means we really need to begin creating our capability. And I think CA doctrine is a great place to jumpstart this. In fact, I think from the US perspective, CA may in fact have the primary role in moving this along, but we need to have the kind of training and education that perhaps we can start by getting these sorts of things fleshed out in doctrine to make everybody aware of it, irrespective of your branch, but also to begin thinking about the infrastructure that we need to develop. For example, one of the things I learned from Afghanistan was that we do not necessarily do a very good job about disaggregating intelligence on the basis of sex and gender. But information like that is going to be crucial for us to be able to provide decent advice in real time in a theater of operations. But of course, that costs money. And it's not just a question of gathering the information. You need to have people who are educated and experienced and skilled in being able to turn that into analysis that commanders and planners are going to be able to use. And then I think the last thing that goes along with that is understanding the depth of the potential solutions. That is, the resources that might be available to be able to take care of some of the problems that you might identify as being threats to the mission and to its personnel from the perspective of gender. And that's going to require a familiarity with the depth and the breadth across the military organization itself, across the military headquarters. And if you're in a multinational force, you need to have some understanding about how your international partners are organized to try to deal with these things. They may have assets and capabilities that you may not ordinarily be aware of, but could be very useful to you in an area of operations. And that's why I think in large part, CA doctrine is the right place to start in terms of really incorporating gender considerations into military planning, but then to take that next step and to evolve it, to get it to the point where it's going to be normed in planning because you're able to talk about it from a risk perspective, not just a risk to the women and the girls in the theater of operations, but to the operation. Over.
Hey, this is Sue. I just want to add on to two things to Jody's point. So one, yes, Jody, that is our ability where CA has fallen flat, especially up at the strategic level, is our inability to communicate to the commander the impact to risk, whether we're mitigating risk or there's an increase in risk. So can't say that enough, and that we have to be better as practitioners in communicating what that risk is. And having gender being one of these key civil components that we need to have an understanding of so that that commander can understand. And then the second piece to expand on, not just within your own forces, that's just where the impact of a solution is. We really need to tie in with our interagency and international partners on the ground, because remember, we're first in, last out. And sometimes they are dealing with the impacts of the solutions that we impose. And so we always need to make sure that we have communicated and understood that impacts. And often we need to consult. I would offer we need to consult before, especially before taking major actions, so that where a lot of these resident experts sit, the lasting impacts are understood, so that when DoD leaves the mission, that there is not, that it can continue on and we have a durable solution. Over.
And I would just like to foot stomp the point on sex disaggregated data and making sure that we are gathering the data that we can to be able to inform those decisions. It is so difficult to be able to make smart decisions without knowing what you're looking at, and having that sex disaggregated data is such a fundamental piece of this.
Hey, Chris, I think you were trying to jump in. This is probably
Okay,
good.
can you guys hear me?
We can.
Great. Hey, this has been really, really, I've been taking pages of notes. I just thought I listened to this with tremendous interest, and I just wanted to pick up on some things that Susan just brought up. And that is, if we're going to kind of break out of our box, we need to really break out of our box, meaning, Jody, I thought your framing of this at the beginning was really interesting, and then I was waiting for the slides on the UN. Because they have a very rich amount of developed policy, and for all one of purposes of discussion, doctrine on gender awareness, gender mainstreaming, women, peace and security, etc. For those of you who are going to be around tomorrow, one of our panelists, in fact, is going to be none other than Major General Hugh Van Roosen, who's a civil affairs officer serving in the second most powerful military office in the UN as the deputy military advisor. Quite a coup. Unfortunately, he's not going to be there much longer, but one of the things he's doing to operationalize gender mainstreaming. If you have seen the UN infantry battalion manual that was just revised at the beginning of this year, the UN has now mandated that every infantry battalion deploying to a peace operations area will have an engagement platoon, not a female engagement platoon, but an engagement platoon. 50% of the engagement platoon must be populated by female personnel. That is one of the requirements for the contributing countries. Also, the CIMIC, the CIMIC offices at the battalion, at the contingent command, and at the mission command level, at the operational level, must also be 50% women. And they even state the reason why. If you're going to engage, be able to engage 50% of the population, you have to have the capability to engage 50% of the population. It's kind of a no-brainer. While I know in our country we tend to be a bit shy about quotas and things like that, I think what's remarkable about this, and obviously it's been signed off by the Department of Peace, is the commitment, the institutional commitment that the United Nations has made towards this idea of integration. So I think we have an awful lot to learn from those organizations. I put in a link, by the way, to a great source of online training at the Peace Operations Training Institute. They have an entire section on gender awareness, gender mainstreaming. They actually have regionalized online courses on how to implement women, peace, and security. One for the Latin American area, one for Africa, and so on. So it's really behooves us, to picking up on Susan's point, and not just on this topic, but it really behooves us to start, reaching out and learning from our partners, going back to that idea of attracting new partners and improving our alliance structures. Just going on, if I may, to me, a lot of this also has to do with leadership, the way we grow leaders. We have to really, really revise the way we grow leaders in the military. And one of them is this. I like this idea of intersectionality awareness or intersectionality analysis, as because if you are looking at this from a much more strategic perspective as a leader, in other words, you have more strategic thinking, then you're going to look at the vast array of capabilities that you can bring to the problem set. You have to understand the problem set. You have to understand what capabilities. Civil affairs people are really good about this because they talk a lot about capabilities and limitations. And with that, then trying to figure out what the comparative advantages are that can be best arrayed to take it on. And just one other thing that I jotted down was Bill's comment on how we can accommodate women in the very unique challenges that they have in balancing their careers with all the other things that go with it. I mean, Anne-Marie Slaughter has written on this copiously for the last 10 years. So there's some just to let people know, there are people that have already looked at a lot of this kind of stuff. And I might reach out to Anne-Marie if we have future panels like this and see if she can come on and talk about this sort of stuff. I'm sure she'd be fascinated to be talking about this with a military audience. And my question, if you will allow me, and then I'll shut up, is I'd like to institutionalize this conversation. I don't want to see this as a one-off. I'd like to see this incorporated into the symposium every year. And so we've got, as they say in the golf game, some follow through. And we don't just hit this once and fire and forget. And then, 5 years from now, we're kind of talking about it all over again. So any thoughts on that are most appreciated. Thank you so much.
Chris, before you sign off, there's a question that you probably may not be able to see from Stefan Mulich. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. How realistic is the demand of 50% female personnel when infantry battalions are 5 to 10% females, making sure we are careful not to become slaves to dogma? And I'm curious your thoughts on that, that thought.
Well, but I think the idea of the engagement platoon in the United Nations is not that you're kind of rebranding infantry people into engagement people. You're, if you will, thinking CA, you're just embedding a CA platoon into your battalion. That's what they're really talking about, or a CIMIC platoon. They just want to call it an engagement platoon because not everybody uses CA or even CIMIC. But they're saying this is the capability that every infantry battalion must have. Whether you import that from your special operations directorate or you import that from another direct, that's fine. That's a troop contributing country decision as to how they do that. The UN's just saying, look, you just must have this capability. How you create it, where you get it from is entirely your business. They don't tell you how to suck the eggs, they just tell you to produce them.
Got it. Thanks for that clarification.
Hey, Caroline, ma'am, this is Sue. I think I saw Major Hancock's question, and I think it's a great one. And his question was, how do female leaders who leave the Army say in their exit interviews, and do we give them exit interviews? And I think that is a fantastic question. And I will tell you that as a commander, there is no requirement to do an exit interview. I did a lot of informal exit interviews when I had soldiers leave, male and female. And I think that part of the challenge is there is still some normalization that as children start to arrive, that often the caregiver responsibility seems to fall generally towards females, and they choose within that partnership to be the one that stays home. I've never had someone come out directly and say, I don't feel supported as a mom. I've just always had people be like, this is just the decision I've had to make. And I think I think you asked a really great question, Major Hancock, and I would offer that maybe we need to do some more formalized in digging into that question, and in that there's maybe, is it they don't expect to be supported, so they just make the decision without that, or do we need to do more? And I think that DoD has been trying to do that with those sabbatical opportunities and some of the services, but I think that we really do need to look at it because we are losing leaders at critical points. That's all I have on that one.
Yeah, Sue, and actually to follow up on that from the business side as well, and those that know me, I'm a hospital administrator on the civilian side, and so have seen different aspects of both providers and other support staff within the hospital. Same question set. And I'll tell you, I was deployed 4 years from 29 to 39, which you'd say is kind of a critical time in family time space. And so it is a big question that you need to ask, that the soldiers need to ask themselves of, hey, am I going to stick around, and what's that going to do to my family decision points? But we see the same thing in the civilian sector. And you're absolutely right, Sue, that oftentimes we see people step out, whether it's the male or the female, to make a family prioritization. And when they try and step back in, they step back into a very different environment, often to their detriment. And so it is something that we, especially in the military's up and out philosophy that we've had for so long, that is something we need to really address differently if we want to encourage anyone to stay and be able to take the proverbial knee at the certain points in their life's time span, particularly as they go through, if they're going to try and do a 20 or 30-year military career. Over.
Yeah. And I would just have one additional point to add on to that, ma'am, is that I would challenge the leaders that are on this call to be creative when you have that soldier that is in front of you making that decision, because there are opportunities to find a way to keep those soldiers. And maybe it's not where you want them, which is on your team, because they're a great soldier. Maybe you need to find them support in a different place, a different unit, a different thing. But to the extent that you can be creative and trying to support those soldiers who are faced with those challenges. And I think we all agree that 100% family should be their priority, right? So, but if we can figure out a way to make this work, as leaders, we need to be creative and figure that out. And I just offer that as a challenge.
And yeah, and to tag team, I feel like we're playing a bit of tennis here. I do think that's important, especially as I sit now in a training community. My soldiers do not get deployed. I was involuntarily deployed every 3 years like clockwork while I was in the 411th, and that was the choice that I made to stay in that unit. But now that I'm in training, I see quite a different perspective where I've got a place that people can be somewhat safe from a deployment standard. Obviously, as a 38, you go outside of CA, and if a deployment status comes up, we are potentially picked individually. But for the most part, we're able to maintain a semblance of a bit of more of the choose your destiny there. And I think those are important things that, just like leaving the military, we have to be able to allow folks to leave the civil affairs community and not be a punitive response when they come back. Because not only does it give a broadening opportunity and it gives you perspectives you would have never had, it also enables just the soldier to have a different time space in terms of their demands. And I'm assuming it's very similar on the AC side. Unfortunately, I can only speak to the RC side since that's been my full career. Over.
We've probably spent way too much time on this question, but I'm going to add here too, because I think it's important. And, you know, I'm sure that my gender has impacted me at various points in my career, but I never felt it so much as when I became a mother. And I don't know that it's necessarily being a female. I think it's when you become a parent. And I think it affects female soldiers and male soldiers in sometimes similar ways and sometimes different ways. But certainly, you know, my son is 2.5, and the only role that I have in which I am completely irreplaceable, I'm replaceable at work, I'm replaceable in my unit, but I'm completely irreplaceable as my son's mother. So, you know, when the hard choices have to be made, I think it's incumbent upon the organization, it's incumbent on the Army or, you know, my civilian job. Obviously, I have to pay the bills, but how much do you want to keep those soldiers? And I think people have to make hard decisions about families, and we all know how many families have been really hurt, how many, you know, people who weren't able to have families at all, even because they prioritize their service or you know, deployment schedules and things and get in the way. And so I think we have to decide, is it worth it to change policies? Is it worth it? And nobody likes to be that soldier that you're getting an exception or there's only so much flexibility that people have. But I think what's the cost to replacing that soldier and what's being lost? And if you've got people dropping off at the rank of major, and then, you know, it takes a long time to build up that experience in someone new. So just thinking about it in a different way of what are we willing to change in order to keep people? Because I think it's the parenthood piece. And one of the NCOs in the unit came up and talked to me because he knew that I had been involved with FRG and his girlfriend was about to have a baby. And we had been talking, the commander had asked me, you know, can you set up a group for the moms, but who's setting up a group for the dads too, you know? And I think it's the being a parent of a young child, not necessarily just being a mother, while certainly recognizing that oftentimes, if it comes down to it, it's the woman who's stepping into that role. So I think it's a how does parenting impact retention, and recognizing the way that disproportionately falls on women. But I think to the extent that it matters to the men, and I think paternity leave policy changes was a step in the right direction. I think it needs to be an everybody problem, because if it's just a women problem, I think it's easy to marginalize that because the numbers, you know, it's a small percentage of the force, especially on the active duty side.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kristen. Although I think Max may argue your replaceability when he's a teenager. You'll I'm
going to be completely persona non grata. I'm surprised he hasn't made an appearance already. I kept thinking about that BBC, you know, thing where the half naked child comes in and you're like, oh, what do I do? So you guys have been lucky so far, but no promises depending on how long this goes.
To follow on Jeremiah Root's question on whether we think there'll be a change in retention promotion now that they've taken off the photos and some other changes. I'm very curious how some of the promotion process, the board process changes will impact the demographics of the force. So I'm not sure I haven't answered your question yet. My jury's still out, but I'd be curious what the other folks are thinking on that question.
Yeah, this is Bill, so I'll kind of pile on that as well. So some of the other changes that are coming for promotion is they're going to take off not only the photo, which was mentioned there, but they're going to take the name off, they're going to take the gender or sex off, and they're going to take the ethnic group off. So when you look at a person's file, you will have no idea what if they're male or female. You have no idea what their ethnic group is and you have no idea what their name is. And we've even had to go back in a couple of cases and change OERs to take out any reference to him or her so that panel members would have no idea the sex of the individual. So those are some other changes that are coming, and part of the hope is that the Army and the other services will then have a greater diversity in ethnic makeup, but also in having more females retained and promoted. So a week or so ago, I was actually listening in on a Army women's panel that was put together by the Public Affairs Office. And one of the panel members was Major General Yeager, who's a female, and commander of the 40th Infantry Division out there in the California National Guard. And she made a good point on recruiting women. And her point was, when you're approaching women that you want to recruit into the military, make the point that in the military, it's equal pay for equal work. So if you're a staff sergeant, all staff sergeants get paid the same, whether you're male or female, it doesn't matter. If you're a captain, all captains get paid the same. And well, obviously there's a change based on length of service, but in generally, all captains get paid the same. And so I think that might be another recruiting technique that we could use to encourage more women to join. Over.
I wanted to go back to Chris's question as he was closing out his remarks about whether it would be helpful to have this be an annual thing, you know, some sort of a panel on gender in CA. And I think one of the attendees commented in the comments about how, you know, we're talking about cultural change here, right? Of course, there was the National Action Plan in 2011, but really the WPS Act only came about in 2017, and the strategy last year, and now we have the implementation plan specific to DoD. This is going to take a long time. It has been taking a long time. And I think it's very helpful for us to continue to check in on this, to monitor progress, to share lessons learned, and to chart a path forward. So I would vote yes.
If I could, I'd like to address a point of information that Stefan posted, which has now been dismissed, but I'd like to go back to it because I'm very curious, Stefan. If I remember correctly, the point of information you posted said that the Women, Peace, and Security community was going to the CIMIC Center of Excellence for advice and assistance in coming up with a doctrine that sounded like Women, Peace, and Security doctrine, and potentially also with policy. And I was just curious about that because I thought, well, it seemed like it would make more sense, perhaps not, to go to the Nordic Center for Gender and Military Operations first, but of course CA is so closely related to that in terms of the things we're talking about here today. Stefan, I guess I have to admit, I've always been thinking of the bi-strategic command directives issued by NATO as basically NATO's WPS policy. I wonder if you could respond to that.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. First of all, short introduction. I'm the head of the KIC branch, Concepts, Interoperability, and Capabilities branch in the Civic Center of Excellence. And yeah, today we were addressed by a Belgian colleague who is double-headed in her second function, working in the WSP community, and she addressed our director. I agree to you. You could argue that we might not be, from an organizational point of view and task point of view, the default point of contact, but obviously due to a good relationship that we have, it was a pragmatic approach, and I just wanted to share that news in your community. Second part of your question, the strategic command directive is not a policy, but the policy is given on the NATO HQ level. So NATO HQ level, MC, a military committee publication is considered to be policy, and the next step to translate that onto the strategic level is a big strategic command directive. So to be honest with you, even if gender and women in peace and security is a well-established topic in NATO, they realize that they are lacking a policy and they are lacking an allied joint publication, and they are now pushing for that. And of course, we are happy to support that. And I just wanted to share that in this very qualified and interested community here. And thank you to the other sir who has given a very good answer to my first question about the 50% female personnel in the engagement platoons. Was very convincing and a good point of view, underlining the relevance of civil affairs and CIMIC in engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, Bill, so I think that we're starting to see people drop and we don't have any more questions.
I've been watching that. So yeah, we're almost to the end anyway. So unless anybody has a last minute question, then we can go ahead and wrap it up there. I'm not sure if that's up to Chris to decide, or we can just decide that amongst ourselves. But it does look like no more questions are coming out. So unless anybody has a last minute question, we can go ahead and wrap up.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Great to have been part of such an experienced panel. I learned so much from listening to you ladies. Most appreciated.
Yeah, likewise. Been an honor to sit virtually next to all of you.